The doctors had already stepped away. The monitors were silent. The hospital room had frozen in that strange way rooms only do when everyone inside has accepted that there is nothing left to do. A man in a suit leaned against the wall, covering his mouth with both hands. The chief doctor pointed toward the door. The nurse stared down at the floor. The baby had stopped breathing several minutes earlier, and every attempt at resuscitation had failed. Then a boy in a torn gray t-shirt pushed the door open and walked in. At first, no one noticed him. His name was Caleb Miller. He was about 11 years old, though he looked small for his age. His boots were covered in mud, and he carried himself with that particular kind of silence learned only by people who have spent too long being invisible. He had followed the ambulance on foot for 3 blocks because he had seen the father running, and something inside him told him to run too. He reached the room before anyone could stop him. What happened in the next 60 seconds would be discussed, documented, and remembered in that hospital for years. Before we continue, if you believe that courage has no address and kindness does not always wear a uniform, please like this video, subscribe to Kane Stories in English, and share it with someone who needs to believe in people again today. Caleb was 11 years old, and for the past 8 months, he had not had a permanent home. Not exactly living on the streets, but close enough. He moved between a church shelter that closed early every morning and a dry corner beneath an overpass, which he had turned into something almost like a room. As much of a room as a concrete ceiling and a cardboard floor could become. Inside his backpack, he carried 3 things: a spare pair of socks, a photograph of his mother, and a small book about the human body that he had found in a donation box outside a clinic 2 years earlier. He had read it so many times that the spine had cracked. That book mattered. Do not forget it. Caleb's curiosity about medicine began when he was 6 years old, the day his little sister stopped breathing for almost a minute because of a severe allergic reaction. A paramedic arrived and brought her back to life with calm hands and precise movements. To Caleb, it was the most important thing he had ever seen a human being do. That day, he decided he wanted to understand the body. How it worked. What could go wrong? What could save it? Without steady access to school, without a library card that remained valid when you had no permanent address, Caleb read everything he could find. Donated medical pamphlets, outdated textbooks left outside university buildings, and that battered book about the human body, which contained a chapter on infant emergencies. When a baby inhales water or fluid, the airway must be cleared before the lungs can begin working again. Caleb had read that chapter many times. He never imagined he would need it. The morning everything happened began like most of Caleb's mornings. He was sitting near the entrance of a park 2 blocks from the hospital, eating half of a granola bar he had saved from the shelter the night before, watching the city come alive. First, he noticed a man in an expensive suit running in a way men in expensive suits almost never run. With total desperation, not caring who saw him, because something had destroyed everything inside him except the emergency. The man was holding a small bundle tightly against his chest. Caleb stood up. He did not know exactly why. He simply stood up. The hospital entrance was 3 blocks away. By the time Caleb arrived, the man had already been led through the emergency room doors. Caleb slipped in behind a family entering through the same doorway and followed the sound of frantic voices down the hall, toward doors that were still swinging. He stepped into the room at the exact moment the chief doctor raised his hand and spoke the words no father is ever ready to hear. The baby was 8 months old. He had been found unconscious at home. The first assessment suggested that he had inhaled fluid, while lying in an infant rocker that had tilted during the brief moment his father was in the next room. By the time his father found him, too much time had passed. The medical team had worked for 4 minutes after arrival without getting any response. The man in the suit, the father, stood crushed against the wall. His name was Harrison Blake. He was the founder of one of the largest private investment firms in the state. In his entire adult life, he had never faced a problem that money could not eventually solve. But in that moment, he was completely powerless. And then the boy in the torn gray t-shirt reached the sink. Caleb saw something the instant he entered the room. A faint movement. The smallest twitch in the baby's fingers, so tiny that everyone else had already missed it. Caleb did not stop to explain. He did not ask permission. He crossed the room calmly, but without hesitation. Carefully, he lifted the baby and placed him on his back beneath a thin stream of cold water, exactly as the book had described. He supported the baby's head and neck with precision, angling the tiny body so gravity could help clear the airway. That was when the doctor pointed at him and shouted. That was when the man in the suit said, "What are you doing?" That was when the nurse began moving toward Caleb. Caleb did not let go of the baby. Without turning around, he said quietly, "Please, give me 1 minute." Something in his voice stopped the entire room. It was not authority. It was not volume. It was something else. The rare stillness of someone who was not pretending to be certain, but truly was. A certainty built over 2 years of reading the same chapter again and again beneath a concrete bridge, because the human body fascinated him, and knowledge was the only thing no circumstance had been able to take away from him. 40 seconds passed. Then the baby coughed. Then he cried. And the entire room exploded into motion. The doctors rushed forward. The monitors were connected again. The nurse who had been moving toward Caleb froze in place, one hand pressed against her heart. A few seconds later, Harrison Blake was sitting on the hospital floor, his face buried in his hands, making a sound that was not exactly crying, but could not be called anything else either. Caleb carefully placed the baby on the examination bed, took 1 step back, and picked up his backpack from where he had left it by the door. He had almost reached the hallway when Harrison lifted his head and said, "Wait. Before we continue, we want to pause here, because what Caleb did in that hospital room was only the most visible part of this story. But Kane Stories wants you to know what made that moment possible. 2 years before that morning, a clinic volunteer named Dorothy Hayes left a box of donated books outside the building after finishing a long shift. She did not sort through them carefully. She did not think about who might pick them up. She simply left them there instead of throwing them away, because throwing books in the trash felt like something a person should not do. Caleb found that box at 6:30 in the morning. He took one book. A retired paramedic named Harold Cooper held informal first aid lessons at the church shelter every second Sunday of the month. He let everyone in. He did not check whether visitors had a permanent address. Caleb attended 3 of those lessons. Harold showed the group how the human airway worked and which position mattered most when a baby could not breathe. Harold never learned Caleb's name. Caleb never forgot what Harold taught him. The shelter manager, a woman named Irene Collins, allowed Caleb to stay 40 minutes longer after closing on cold mornings when she saw he had nowhere warm to go. She never wrote it down in a log. She simply did not lock the door until Caleb finished reading whatever he was reading. None of those people were in that hospital room. And yet, all of them were there. That is what Kane Stories believes. Every act of human decency travels much farther than the person who performs it will ever know. A box of books. Dorothy. Harold's Sunday lessons. Irene's unlocked door. All of them entered that room with Caleb. Harrison Blake found Caleb in the hallway. He had left his newly saved son in the care of the medical team. He followed the boy through the corridor and stood in front of him with an expression that held nothing rehearsed, nothing controlled. Just a man who had stood at the edge of the worst moment of his life and had been pulled back because a boy in a torn t-shirt refused to accept what everyone else had already accepted. Harrison asked Caleb where he lived. Caleb told the truth. Harrison did not react with pity or with that fragile discomfort some people show when poverty comes close enough to become real. He asked Caleb 2 more questions. What do you want to do with your life? And then, what do you need to get there? The agreement that followed was not charity. Harrison made that clear from the beginning, and Caleb made it just as clear that he would not have accepted it as charity. It was an investment. Harrison had spent 20 years identifying people with something extraordinary inside them and making it possible for that extraordinary thing to grow. He had simply never found someone like that in a hospital hallway before. An 11-year-old boy with a broken spine book inside his backpack. Before the end of the month, Caleb was enrolled in school. He was placed with a foster family that Harrison's foundation had supported for years. The Brennan family, a couple with 3 other children. A loud kitchen. The kind of home where the door always seemed open because someone was always coming in. He was given a tutor twice a week, a library card, and a winter coat. Caleb asked if he could keep the book about the human body. No one even imagined saying no. For years later, Caleb was the top science student in his school. At 14, he attended a regional medical symposium as the only middle school student there. He sat in the front row and asked 2 questions. The doctor who gave the lecture later told his colleagues they were the sharpest questions he had been asked all day. Harrison's son, who was now 5 years old, called Caleb by a nickname that had formed over years of visits and did not fully translate into adult language. It meant something like the one who stayed, because that was what Caleb did. When everyone else stepped back, Caleb stayed. On the evening before Caleb's first day of high school, he sat at the Brennan family's kitchen table and wrote a letter. Not to Harrison. Not to the doctors. He wrote to Dorothy, whose full name he had discovered by tracing the donation box back to its source. He wrote to Harold Cooper, the retired paramedic now living in a small town 2 hours away. And he wrote to Irene Collins, the shelter manager. He told them what had become possible because of their small decisions. Dorothy replied in less than a week. She said she had not thought about that box of books in 2 years, that she cried for 20 minutes after reading the letter, and then called her sister so she could read it aloud again. Harold answered on paper so old that the edges had turned yellow. He wrote that he had been giving those Sunday lessons for 11 years, and this was the first time he had ever learned what happened afterward. Irene did not reply. But the shelter director told Caleb several months later that Irene had framed the letter and hung it on the wall beside the door she used to leave open on cold mornings. The same door she continued to leave open. Never write someone off because of where they sleep tonight. Never assume that because someone is nothing, they know nothing. Never confuse silence with emptiness, or worn-out boots with a small life. And never forget that the knowledge capable of saving a life can live inside a box left on a sidewalk by someone who simply could not bring herself to throw a book away. If this story touched your heart, like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to believe in people again today. Subscribe to Kane Stories for more stories about courage, resilience, and the quiet human decisions that change everything. Because kindness does not always arrive in a white coat. Sometimes it arrives in a torn gray t-shirt, carrying a book with a broken spine. And it stays when everyone else has already walked away. Welcome to Kane Stories. We are very glad you are here.